Last week, we said that from Adam and Eve sinning and being kicked out of the garden, things somehow managed to go even further downhill. We heard about Cain killing Abel, and God eventually deciding to wipe the earth clean with a flood. But the one good man that God could find was Noah. Noah obeyed God's instructions to build the ark. And after the flood, God repeated the instructions he'd given to Adam and Eve, telling Noah and his family to have children and fill the earth with their descendants. So as far as our 4 clues go, we have Noah and his family, living on the kind of new earth after the flood, having obeyed God's instructions to build the ark and continuing to obey his new instructions to look after the world and the animals, and enjoying all of the rich blessings of the earth, including rainbows now. A little while later, God steps up his rescue plan. Remember God's words to Satan about one of Eve's descendants utterly defeating him one day? Well, it was time to take the next step towards that. And this is where Abraham comes in. God spoke to Abraham and told him, "Leave your country, your father's household, and go to a land I will show you. I will give you many descendants, and they will become a great nation. And all nations on earth will be blessed through you." So when Abraham was 75 years old, he set out, with his wife and his nephew and their flocks and their servants, and they went to the land of Canaan. After wandering around in Canaan for a while, God spoke to Abraham again and said, "Look around you in all directions. All of this is the land I'm going to give to you and your descendants. And I'll give you so many descendants that it'll be impossible to count them." Incredible, right? This is a truly amazing promise that God makes to Abraham, that's centered around land and descendants, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. But there's a problem. Abraham and his wife are now very old and they don't have any children. So how are they going to have many grandchildren and great-grandchildren and so on if they don't have any children first? But that's what God promised him. Abraham was certainly grateful to God for his amazing promise, but as the years went on without a child, Abraham got more and more nervous about how it was ever going to come true. And so he sinned and took matters into his own hands. He had a child with his wife's servant girl. He knew God's promise, but he stopped trusting God to make this promise come true. He stopped trusting that God's way was the best way, and he tried to make it come true in his own way. But God is good and loving and forgiving, and God always keeps his promises. So even though Abraham sinned, God spoke to Abraham and told him once again that he would have many descendants, but to trust God because they would do it God's way. When Abraham was 100 years old and his wife Sarah was 90, and they were both far too old to be able to have children, Sarah became pregnant and she gave birth to their son Isaac. As always, God had kept his promise. So now we have God's people, Abraham and Sarah and their son Isaac, living in God's place, Canaan, obeying God's instructions, eventually, and enjoying God's blessings. The son who was always coming but whom they had to be patient for. Some years later, God again spoke to Abraham and said, "Take your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer Isaac as a sacrifice to me on a mountain there." Wait, what? So God promises Abraham many descendants and then doesn't give him even a single child for years and years, and then by some miracle God gives him a son in his old age, and there's finally hope for God's promise of descendants, and then God tells Abraham to go and sacrifice his only son on a mountain. How is God's promise going to come true? What is God doing? Take a moment, pause the video and chat about how you would feel if you were Abraham at this point in time. Well, Abraham did take Isaac to Moriah and went up the mountain just as God had told him. Isaac carried the wood to build the altar himself. And Abraham built the altar, laid Isaac on it, took a knife and was just about to kill his only son when God spoke. "Abraham, stop! Look over there!" And there, caught in a thorn bush, was a ram. God had provided the sacrifice after all. Isaac was saved and the promise lived on. And so there on that mountain where Jerusalem would later be built, by the way, Abraham's only son, whom he loved, was offered as a sacrifice. And just at the right time, God stepped in and provided the sacrifice there on that hilltop in Jerusalem. Because God always, always, always keeps his promises.